This is the Business Storytelling Show with Christoph Trapp. Name a top 20 storytelling podcast and a top 5% podcast globally. Christoph chats with thought leaders and experts to share tips and tricks that can help you tell your company's stories better to drive business results. Available wherever you listen to podcasts, live streamed on major social media channels, and part of the DB&A television network. Available on most U.S. television sets and streaming on Roku and Amazon Fire. Here's Christoph with today's episode. Let's go.
Let's go, business storytellers. Hey, how's everyone doing? Today we want to talk about inaction. Kind of a foreign concept to me, quite frankly. It's very difficult for me just to sit here and not do anything, as you might know. Let's do a podcast. Go live now. What are we waiting for? But some of you in corporate America are really stricken by this let's not do anything bug, right? Oh, let's have a strategy. You know how many strategies I've read that are just sitting on a shelf and they're wonderfully written. Here's how we talk to our prospects. Here's how we create content, whatever it might be. And then we do nothing with it. We'll see if, I'm looking at my guest backstage, if she's nodding at me or going, well, no, that's not, I've never heard of that before. So we will find out what she has to say about that. Jen Ellen is the chief evangelist at Challenger. And I'm pretty sure I ran across her listening to another podcast. I don't remember which one right this second, but inaction is such a disease. Why is that happening? And how do we move forward from it? Let's get her on the show here. Jen, nice to see you.
Great to see you and excited to be here today. Thanks so much for having me.
Perfect fist bump to get the show going. That's always half the battle. Not to smack the camera. That's always my challenge. So tell me about, I mean, I'm not wrong, right? When it comes to some of these inaction illnesses going around, but why is that happening?
Yeah, you're absolutely not wrong. I was vigorously nodding as you were opening this up. And it's fascinating, right? If you think back to anyone that was sort of in business in 08, 09 and can recall that nightmare of a time, it's actually far less to do with where the market is in terms of the economy, and actually far more to do with the uncertainty that presents anytime there's a question mark around that, right? So when there's a question mark around, is the economy going up or down? Are we going to have continued layoffs? What tends to happen is that we as humans want to preserve same because same is safe. Now, the problem with that is oftentimes we as customers, as buyers, even in our own personal life, will knowingly make a wrong or bad decision, but continue to do so because it's the devil we know. However, when we are, so I sell to salespeople, I've been in sales for the last 17 years. When we are wired to sell, we are trying to convince someone why change is better. But what we fail to appreciate a lot of times is in many cases, good is good enough. So better rarely wins about good enough. So inaction is typically a result of a fear of uncertainty, a fear of change, and that presents itself especially in markets like this.
Yeah, I mean, I see it all the time, and I'm just thinking about when you talk about people want to keep the status quo. I don't think that's the term you use necessarily, but that's right. I mean, I was speaking at a conference actually a few years ago, and somebody put the podium in the middle of the stage. And when I got up there, I said, "Who in the world put this podium up here, and why is it still sitting here? 3 keynotes down the, because it's like the status quo. Once it's there, it's there. We don't want to move things around. But what if we have to think about it like change? So I'll just, when you were talking about that, I'm thinking, okay, my career has focused around how do I tell better stories, but how I do that for companies is vastly different today than it was 15 years ago, right? We didn't have live streams. We didn't have automation. Like if we send an email, we actually literally had to send the email manually, So why would it be easier if we don't think about it as change and just how do we make it easier?
Yeah, I think effort, to your point, is a really big part of this, right? Part of what people despise about change is not only the uncertainty, but the effort that goes with it, right? So let's say I'm a buyer and I'm going to buy something, and we hear this all the time. Like, I can look at a solution and say, man, that is a snazzy solution. That is so much better than what we're doing today. I believe in it. I see value in it. That company is a company that I think gets it. But there's this weird thing that happens that starts to creep up where all of a sudden I, as a buyer, start thinking, what if something goes wrong, right? What if I move us off of what we've always done onto this new solution or new approach? And then all of a sudden someone throws their hands up and is like, you know what? I really like this thing about the old way so much better. Or what if something goes wrong? This is all risk to political capital. And so part of our job when we are storytelling in any sort of business environment, especially in sales, is to help mitigate the associated risk and uncertainty and fear that goes along with change. How we do not do that is by talking about how great things are. How we do that is by being upfront and being a true partner to our customers and our partners and expressing, here are all the things that we should be mindful of may go off the rails. Because when we put that out on the table, one, it's not expected by buyers. They expect us to tell the rosy story. But two, it allows us to have a meaningful conversation so that fear, unnecessary fear doesn't prevail over clearer minds. So I think that's a big thing that candidly I got wrong a lot is I would always just hope to sweep it to the side, but learning to have a true meaningful conversation around X, Y, and Z are usually the things that freak out buyers from making this decision.
Very, very interesting. And trying to figure out what those things are, I guess, certainly makes a big difference. But how do you find that out? I mean, because sales is very different today than it was 15 years ago, right? I mean, some of the things sold themselves, and there's only two options, and there's only two vendors. I mean, I'm thinking about publishing, right? I mean, in publishing, salespeople used to go to somebody and they would buy it no matter what because that's what they've done and that's kind of what they do, and they have the budget, and there you go. Let's go have a beer. We're done. Um, but how do you really figure out what those concerns are? I mean, I'm thinking about sometimes when I have salespeople call me or really anybody, and they want, I mean, it's like a therapy session sometimes, right? Just like, what are your problems? And I'm like, well, where do you want to start? And you know what I mean? So how do you build that trust, whether it's on the content side or the sales side or the the company level? How do you get there? How do you figure that out in a meaningful way?
Love this question. And I think there's a lot of things that have made selling harder over the last 20 years. But one thing that is incredibly easier is just forming a point of view or perspective prior to making that call, right? So, as an example, if I was selling Challenger to sales leaders 15 years ago, I would have to, one, hope that my territory was primarily public companies. I would have to sift through 10Ks and annual reports and hope to find goodness in there. And it's not to say that that is not a worthwhile strategy. We can all still do that. But the problem with that is there's a boatload of companies that are not public who don't publicize their earnings and their risks and their, strategies and things like that. So that was always the tricky part. Now, fast forward to today, one of the ways that I think is really under leveraged is recognizing that the fact that I'll say many company leaders are out there publicly talking about how their organizations are trying to grow and trying to win. And so if you do something as simple as Google the CEO's name plus podcast or CEO's name plus interview, the amount of information and insight that pops up in a simple Google search is stuff that we just didn't have before. So my advice and my tactic that I recommend to sellers and to anyone trying to make a more informed conversation and build that credibility and trust is to use those resources to understand what is the company's A state, so that's their current state. What is it that the company's B state is? Where are they trying to get to? And what does it seem like the conventional thinking is of how they get from A to B based on how they talk about their company's growth strategy, what they're trying to pursue? And then within that A to B, where is there conventional wisdom, a belief system, a piece of information that seems to be informing them to take that path from A to B, but actually their path looks like this, right? So we're looking for a flawed assumption, a flawed belief system that we can then go and disrupt. So you take that, and what that allows you to do is enter into a conversation and not show up and say, hey, I'm Jen from ABC Company, and this is why we're the world's leading provider of who cares, but rather go in and say, listen, I saw your CEO, Joe, the other day talking about how you just made a few acquisitions in pursuit of getting into this AI space. Now, out of curiosity, one of the things that a lot of sales organizations see is like when you move from selling a physical product to a service or a software or an AI product, there's some complexities there that make it much harder for a seller to sell a non-physical product. Out of curiosity, Are you bumping into that at all? I'd love to compare your observations versus mine, right? So it is not a thesis or a dissertation, right? It is typically 15 minutes of reading transcripts from interviews and podcasts and things like that, and then going in with a perspective. So to your point, it is not, hey, open up to me, stranger, tell me all your problems and needs, which is reality, just really a lot of work for the buyer.
Up to me therapy with the sales team. And a lot of these tips really, I mean, they can be used for the sales team, they can be used on the content team, they can be used really, for paid digital, really anywhere. Because if you don't understand what your customer is actually facing, what their perceived problems are, and then also that it's not a linear process. I think a lot of people struggle with that, right? It's very I just rather go straight ahead. Maybe that's because of the way our roads are constructed in the United States, other than Boston. Now you talk about right, because that's because of the
I
cows
was
or
just there
something,
yesterday, so timely, yes.
something like that. But so you talk about 38% of B2B sales conversations actually end in no decision, which is crazy from both ends of the conversation. Because so if I'm thinking about, I've been on plenty buying committees, let's call them that for lack of a better term. And if I'm thinking that one out of those three will be a complete waste of my time, not because we decided that's not the right tool or we decided that is the right tool, but because we decided that we're not going to do anything. What a waste of time. So why is that happening? Is it really just happening because we're not telling the right story? Is it happening because of internal politics? Is it happening because all of the above, or something else?
This is such a great question. And I love to relate it to our personal lives, right? Think about the last time you tried to get 10 people to go to a restaurant and make a decision on which restaurant to go to. That in and of itself, I don't know about your friends, but with my friends, it's like a text chain of 100 texts. And then it ends up like, let's just switch the date because now somebody has something come up, right? So it's hard to make a decision on a restaurant or a pizza topping or things that are so insignificant. Now you take that into a B2B environment, and the reality is we've tracked this on average, right? There will be more, there will be less, but on average in a B2B sales process, the number of stakeholders on the customer side that were directly or indirectly involved has gone up in 2015 from an average of 5.4 to just 5 years later in 2020 an average of 11.2. That is explosive, right? You're talking about truly herding cats. And the added complexity with COVID is that now many of these people are not in the same physical setting. They are jumping from call to call. And so the idea or the notion of doing anything is really, really difficult because you face this inertia from 10, 11 people who, in many cases, don't work together on a regular basis, having different perspectives on the problem, how important the problem is to solve, what the solution should be, and who they should go for it. So, in reality, I think what we're finding is a lot of the 38% losses aren't coming at late stage. Hey, we looked at these three vendors and then we just decided to do nothing. It's actually happening early stage where the buying group just comes together and says, you know what, forget it. This is so much extra work as to what's already on my plate. Let's just keep doing what we're doing because we can live with it. Right. And so you see this evolution of people who intentionally want to change, just going back and settling for good enough.
Well, what's interesting about that, I was working with a team once, and they had a big project coming down the pike, and it was like last minute. And I know it wasn't a marketing emergency necessarily, but it was a big project. And I'm like, I literally can't deal with this unless I move these other things. So I think you have to be very, very deliberate, actually moving things along that you're not going to focus on, because you literally have to spend the next 2 days reading this document, analyzing it. And maybe
Yeah.
I've been at fault myself, because I remember a project where I didn't really care which way we were going to go. And one person who was apparently opposed to the change put together this long spreadsheet, and I barely read it, because I'm like, I don't really care what's in here. I mean, I skimmed it. So maybe it was my fault, or maybe it was the other people who felt they had to respond to the spreadsheet. Jen, when Scott Brinker was on the show, he talked about the real political dangers when you buy a big system. So, for example, I sign up for Buffer for a company, right? I mean, the political whatever political danger is really low, right? Because it's a low
Mhm.
cost, it's easy to implement. If we don't like it, whatever, we'll just change it. We might even eat the cost for a year, right? But if I'm implementing a huge system, the political danger is really much higher, especially if I'm in a toxic culture. How do we maneuver those things?
Ugh, this is the reality of selling today. And I think what we've even observed is the price point of what we consider significant is dropping, right? Like before, it'd be like, oh, if you buy a CRM solution, there's a ton of political capital at risk. And now I think even smaller solution sizes, just as people restrain capital expenditures, are being viewed that way. So, one of the fascinating things is when you look at a conversation between a business and a potential customer, one of the things that we have just been wired to do, this is candidly how I grew up selling back in '04 when I started, was you are teaching them why your solution is better, right? If you look on any company website, show me one that does not have the word better or faster or some ER ending word plastered all over it. And the trouble with better, as we talked about before, is in many cases, good is good enough. So if I think, let's say, for example, I went through this experience. I came across the company Chili Piper. And for those that don't know Chili Piper, they have a way for a prospect who's interested in your service on your website to just book immediately with the AE calendar. Now, I saw that. I thought, man, this is awesome. It's going to slow the lag of getting back to prospects. We know that's really important. We know as a company that new logo acquisition is really, really important. So clearly, this is a no brainer, right? But for me to actually push that through the organization required that I get legal involved, finance involved, IT involved, sales involved, marketing involved. And so it ended up being for a really, really low price point, all of this like chaos and organization and herding cats of people. Now, in my circumstance, I was so passionate about the size of the problem that this solution solved. I was willing to put political capital at risk because I was willing to tie it to this initiative. But that's because the size of the problem that we had, to me, was so massive, it was worth going all in. Now, if Chili Piper had just called and say, "Hey, we've got a faster way for people to book meetings, and it's really cool, and here's all the features and benefits," I never would have been as activated by that, and I probably wouldn't have gone through the process because it was a lot of extra work. So it's a long way of saying when we are positioning our solutions and our services, we actually have to be mindful not to lead with that. And rather, what's really going to activate an executive stakeholder is by giving them insight on how big an underappreciated problem is and showing them how they become the hero, not us by the solution, but them by being the person that raises this and relieves this pressure, this tension, this risk inside the business. So our message should actually be far more about helping customers learn about themselves as opposed to helping customers learn about our solution.
Well, and making things easier. And when you were just mentioning that, the one thing I was thinking of, the all of our emails, Jen, to this point, except my first outreach to you, has been automated, right? In 1 week, in one day, I'm going to start promoting the show. If you can't make the date, let me know right now. Please use the link to reschedule. I hope to see you though. Day out. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. If you don't have the link, let me know. 90 minutes after the show is already live. Here's where it is. Here's how it's going to go from here. That's the last email. You don't have to decline the meeting to get out of any other emails. But my point is, that technology solution has made my life so much easier, right? But it also creates, I need a different skill set to actually think about what email should go when, what makes sense, what's just annoying, right? But overall, it's made my life easier. But how do you get people, whether it's from content? I mean, you can write, about this stuff until you're blue in the face, right? And people hopefully will see it. But how do you get people to understand that it can actually make their lives easier? And I know it's hard because when I was in journalism, I was including myself. Everybody is fighting changes. You want me to write in a box? A computer is now rating my writing, which has been one, I mean, for real, right? But today, I couldn't live without Grammarly. I think Grammarly, I'm like, whatever, I'm not going to learn what to put commas correctly. Grammarly is doing it for me. So it's made my life easier, right?
Yes. No, it's so true. I think what's fascinating though is the story you just told is what I don't see enough companies telling, right? Instead of telling the story of how much better life is, it's intensifying the pain of how insane it is to keep operating where you would, in your instance, right? Like just you manually sending emails. So storytelling is obviously we're on the business storytelling show. It's a significant part about it, but it's storytelling on the problem. Sometimes we as humans make these stupid Oftentimes, we make these stupid decisions until we hold a mirror up to our face and recognize what is the cost of our action or our inaction, right? What is the cost of continuing to do things the way we are? So, in that instance, right, if I'm a sales rep for that organization, I'm actually playing out what does that manual process look like, right? What is the frustration? What is the feeling? What is the emotions? And then I'm doing something which most prospects are not doing, which is I'm actually sizing it. So, all right, Christoph, every month you're doing X number of podcasts, you have X number of guests, which means there are 5 emails in a series. It takes you 5 minutes to write each of those emails. So basically, Christoph, every month you light on fire 4 to 5 hours doing something that could be offset manually. And then that's when you transition into, but here's why I know you're going to be skeptical. Like, is the quality going to be high enough? And you're preempting the objection because, to your point, whoever sold that to you has heard that objection before. It's just sometimes as sellers, we wait until we hear it because we hope we can eke by without it. But I think that's the benefit of authenticity. You're taking a buyer down this path and you're thinking just like they do. So they are more likely to pull you in. And that's the value or the beauty of having a live person behind that message instead of just static content.
And I'm trying to remember the number that Marcus Sheridan quoted when he was on the show. He was talking about how salespeople should just create videos answering some of the most common questions, because why do you have to repeat them over and over? And I want to say, he said maybe 80% of what salespeople hear, they've heard, a gazillion times. That's not the exact number, obviously, but so why not have some content that you can send them, or you can kind of drip out to them, one by one. I'm personally a big fan of getting snippets of information, right? So if somebody sends me a long email, I actually got one the other day, must have been 2,000 words of stuff. I'm sure it's good stuff, but I don't have time to read a 2,000 word email. But I might have time to read 20 emails of 100 words that are
Yeah.
well timed, right? So I don't know why people don't think about that.
I mean, I'll tell you why they don't, because they go into an organization, they get training on their product and their solution, and then they go regurgitate everything they learned, right? Because that's what they think wins. But you're exactly right. Like, we live in a TikTok 15-second, 30-second culture, and that's the appetite that our readers, our buyers, the consumers of information have. And I think when we relieve ourselves from that tendency to try to write novels, like, the belief system that's behind that is the prospect is going to open up that email and be like, man, Jen is so smart and educated about this. When in reality, what you said is what happens. They're like, I don't have time to read this. This person clearly doesn't understand what I'm up against.
No, and my favorite one, and then I'll let you talk about Challenger, what that is, and who do you work with and whatnot, is the people that email me 4 times, have you read my email below? And then the next thing is, have you read my email below? And I'm like, are you serious? Like, I literally have to go back down and read the email. I didn't read the first 4 times. So crazy stuff, but certainly people can learn, and we can always learn how to tell stories better and how to display them better and how to present them better, no doubt. Challenger Inc. Tell us about that. You're the chief evangelist there. Who do you work with? Who should reach out? And you have a podcast, of course, too.
Yeah. So Challenger Inc. is the company behind the books, The Challenger Sale, The Challenger Customer, and Effortless Experience. So lots of people know about the Challenger sales methodology. Not a lot of people know that Challenger Inc. is an organization that works with commercial teams to help them implement that Challenger thinking, that Challenger mindset into the minds of their sellers, their marketers, so that you have a cohesive way of thinking about how do we disrupt status quo with your customers. So we typically work with sales organizations, big and small, all different stages of growth, but particularly companies that say, hey, we lose a lot to no decision. We can't just keep selling our solution and the benefits of it. We have to have a different talk track. So that's who we work with. And then, yes, I host our weekly Winning the Challenger Sale podcast, where I bring in guests who think and show up like challengers to share how they execute on challenger thinking in the real world.
Fantastic. Very interesting. And of course, you mentioned marketing and sales. So my final thought always is, work with marketing. Don't just use them as, I need a prettied up PowerPoint. Work with a proactive marketing team, proactive content strategy team. There was a show the other day on Real Talk, the Customer Insights show, which I produce, where they talked about proactive research. And the proactive content, proactive marketing is very similar, right? You actually get ahead of things, you create things, and you're not just a order shop, so to speak. What was the
Yeah.
website for Challenger, Jen?
It's challengerinc.com.
Challengerinc.com. storytellers.com. Thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing your insights. Very enlightening.
Thank you so much.
That's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in. Please rate and review our show on your favorite podcast channels. And don't forget to share this episode with your networks. We appreciate you. Until next time.